All right, so we're going to start. So we are delighted to be here to welcome you all to the Martha Foschi Lecture. First, I just want to recognize that we're gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And as we engage with this wonderful talk, let's all consider how we can contribute to reconciliation, both as individuals and as this department and university. The Martha Foschi Lecture does three main things. First, it honors Martha and her contributions to sociology as a whole and to our department. Second, it recognizes the work of one of our faculty members who embodies Martha's excellence in both research and teaching. And finally, it gives us the wonderful opportunity to bring an outstanding scholar to our department for a talk, and we are delighted that Dr. Jane Sell has come here today to speak with us. But first things first, I want to start by introducing Martha and her work. And then I will pass the microphone, virtual, to Amy to present the Foschi Award. Martha received her BA from the Universidad de Buenos Aires and her PhD from Stanford University. Throughout her long and illustrious career, she's made significant contributions to a wide variety of areas, including social psychology, theory construction, experimental research, and cross-cultural comparisons. It would be impossible to summarize such a wide and groundbreaking set of research. However, just to note a few areas of her focus, she's worked on the study of status characteristics, performance expectation, and how they influence behavior in task groups. She's contributed greatly to research on gender, biased evaluation, and competence double standards in the workplace. And she's brought her social psychological lens to the study of immigration and race and ethnicity. Among her long list of publications, her books, Group Processes, Sociological Analysis, and Status Generalizations, New Theory and Research, are touchstones for the social psychological study of group and status. These books made quite a splash. Status Generalizations in particular was described in the American Journal of Sociology as, quote, a state-of-the-art compilation, and, quote, an authoritative, accessible orientation to the methodological viewpoint and the substance of this important research area. So we are delighted to honor Martha Foschi's groundbreaking work and to celebrate her contributions to our department and the discipline. Now I have the pleasure of passing it over to Amy, who is going to announce the winner of this year's Martha Foschi Award.
So Martha has very kindly endowed this award. It's the Foschi Award for Excellence in Sociological Research and Teaching. And the winner of this award is Dr. Tom Kempel, who is not here at the moment because he's actually in Berlin. He offered to Skype in, but I thought that was too complicated or Zoom in. He knows he's the recipient of this award. But since he's not here, I'm going to make a quick list of his accolades since he's not here to hear all the wonderful comments about him. So I will just say that Tom is an accomplished scholar with numerous monographs, articles, edited books, and more, with his primary contributions in the form of his creative reinterpretations of theorists like Marx, Weber, Simmel, and Durkheim. Tom is also an accomplished teacher and mentor with the Killam Teaching Award and a Killam Graduate Mentorship Award, and an impressively long list of both graduate and undergraduate students whose research he has mentored. And in recent years, Tom has brought research and teaching together in very compelling and creative ways through his teaching work in the Urban Ethnographic Field School and a global seminar in Guatemala, both of which provide research opportunities for students, but also through research he's currently engaging in that examines these very field schools and the experiences of students and the community partners in these kind of research engagements. So he's truly bringing research and teaching into dialogue with each other. In his teaching statement, Tom reflected on how Martha actually was really a model for him when he came to UBC as a way of putting commitments to teaching and research together. And he recalled a statement, Martha, that you made at a department meeting, which was no students before noon, which he thought exemplified like finding that balance between pursuing rigorous research and supporting students. And I thought that was a wonderful piece of advice. I'm not sure I'll be able to stand up to, but so Tom has a lovely certificate that Christine made for him, and when he returns from his European sojourn, we'll pass it on to him.
So yes, thank you so much, Amy, and congratulations, Tom. Not even virtually, but we can imagine. And now I'm going to pass it over to Martha, who has the pleasure of introducing our wonderful speaker. So Martha.
Thank you both for this introduction. And thank you also to all of those who are present here today. I'd like to begin by outlining the idea of the award and how that was introduced in 2014 by Professor Gabi. He proposed it to the department and who voted and, as we know, supported it. Then it passed all of the approved required university levels. Subsequent heads continued enthusiastically with the events associated with this award. And these were Professor Francesco Duino, Sean Lauer, V.S. Teklo, and currently Professor Catherine Corrigan-Brown. I would like to point out that the decisions on this award are made by two committees. This was slightly referred to. And the two committees work separately and I'm not a member of either, as appropriately. Sincere congratulations to the two persons who received an award this time. The award cites my work in experimental social psychology, and that is what I've been doing for a number of years. My areas of interest are theory construction, hypothesis testing in social psychology. The main focus of my work has been on how prejudices regarding the competence of one or more persons are based, and, for example, prejudices based on gender or skin color, and what can be done to block them. With the intelligent and involved participation of my research assistants over several years, most of them were graduate students in the department, we were able to complete 16 experiments. Among the assistants who were among these assistants, they were paid out of the grants I received. I don't believe in requiring volunteers, and they received a sum for their participation. The studies investigated the role of gender, performance, ethnicity, and the occurrence of double standards in certain situations. Subsequently, researchers investigating status and skin color. It would be interesting to add other status characteristics, and I am hereby proposing that this has not been really done thoroughly in social psychology to study rural versus immigrant as a status factor, and native-born versus foreigners. With that, I now turn to the next speaker. Thank you.
Hello, I'm very honored to be here, and I'm glad to be here at last, actually. We all got interrupted in many things. So thank you all, and I look forward to talking to many of you a little later, or even now. So please stop me if you have questions. I'm going to talk about some areas in research that I've been involved with, and others, of course, have been involved with, on racial ethnic discrimination, and look at some questions and some answers from experimental social psychology. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two different kinds of theoretical investigations, and I imagine I might get some pushback. It'll be interesting to hear from you all too. And then I'm going to talk about what good are experiments, something that's near and dear to Martha and my heart. And then I'm going to give a quick review of some experiments specifically on race ethnicity, and then come back to that issue. Talk about some principles we've learned, and then talk about only a few of the many mysteries and questions that remain. Okay, so there are ways to conceptualize different kinds of theories, of course. And one way to conceptualize them that I've talked about is in terms of descriptive theoretical or formal theoretical approaches, so two different kinds. And descriptive are called descriptive because they deal with ordinary concepts. And ordinary concepts are concepts of our everyday experience. They use our everyday language. They're defined by particular places or times. So I have two questions here that are ordinary. How does the time exposed to TikTok videos in the fall of 2022 affect individuals' appreciations for science classes in the spring of 2022? And there's another question here about teaching from Jane Austen novels versus teaching from hidden from history, 300 years of women's oppression in the fight against it. So these are ordinary because they are specific references, they're specific points in time. Okay? Ordinary language is the language that I'm using right now. It's the language that we usually use when we have our everyday kinds of interactions, and it's meant to be specific to certain times and places, such as 1200 or 2020, or certain places or culture, such as London. Here's a descriptive theoretical question, which is very important. In the US, how does immigration status of people in 2022 affect discrimination towards these immigrants in 2022? And it's a very important question, but as stated, it refers to a specific kind of history and a specific point in time, right? In the unique history, as we all know, of the United States. Formal theoretical approaches are characterized by their use of a different kind of language, a foreign language that's different from ordinary because it's precise and it doesn't deal with things that are changing. It's abstract. Another way to think about this in more formal terms is that it uses what are known as exact class concepts. And we're used to thinking about exact class concepts in mathematics, for example, where things are so abstract that they don't change in their meaning. A 2 is always a 2, it's not a 2.1 or a 2.3, it's always a 2, right? So it's abstract and never changing. So a formal theoretical question somewhat parallel to that first descriptive question is, how does a person's entry into a region without legitimized legal status affect the treatment of that person by those with legitimized legal status? In some ways, this question, even though it's very abstract, is more limited in scope than that first question, the descriptive question. So the language, or this abstract kind of language, implies that the person who's doing research has a formal theoretical argument. And that this argument uses these concepts that never change, that are independent of time and space. And furthermore, the argument, which is assumed when you're using a formal theory, includes abstract scope conditions, or sometimes they're called parameters, or in political science, they're usually called boundary conditions. They are abstract scope conditions under which the argument applies. So even though the theory is phrased in terms that are abstract and never change, they must be defined to enable testing instances of these abstract concepts. So one way that you can think about this, it's oversimplified, but one way to think about it is that if you start with ordinary language, then this is a descriptive theory. If you start with abstract formal theory, if you start with abstract concepts, then it's a formal theory. Okay, so those are two ways we can think about different kinds of theoretical approaches. But I want to argue something even more, and that is ordinary language can also often create problems for us. Social characteristics, especially, often have complicated histories and uses in ordinary language, and they're often for political kinds of purposes. So to presume we know what these social characteristics actually mean can be problematic. And I think that we've seen a lot of such problems in looking at issues like gender or race, ethnicity. Ordinary language, because it's used in everyday interaction, leads to the idea that we could not possibly do research on tribal membership, let's say in South Sudan, which tribal membership is a very important distinction in South Sudan. That we could not do research on such tribal membership that would have implications for race in Canada because the culture and history are so very different. And this is true for descriptive studies. There are very unique histories, very unique kinds of circumstances. So ordinary understandings of race, ethnicity has lots of different components, and we think about how we think about race, ethnicity when we talk, when we conjecture. But some of these categorizations are very insidious, and they point out problems when we assume that we know what we're talking about when we use ordinary concepts. And it's easy to see, especially easy to see with race. So race was long assumed to be a biological given. Well, why do people look different? Because biologically they're different, right? Okay, that was the ordinary kind of assumption. Rather than thinking about issues about power and issues about constraint, but rather how biology actually created these differences. And this was the case for gender too. So my point is that ordinary concepts and sort of taken for granted knowledge in our everyday language can restrict and constrict theoretical development. And sociologists are not at all immune to this. In sociology, for example, it's occurred in many ways. For example, research in sociology often seems to imply that racial categories are simply properties of individuals. But seeing that race ethnicity is a property of individuals seems to mask the idea and disguises the idea of social construction by ignoring interaction that creates the inequalities or discrimination. So discrimination and inequality don't just happen to people, they're created, they're developed, and they're reproduced through interaction. And I think a really clear case of this, and one that still very much remains, is the idea of biology. This is a quote by medical anthropologist Gravely, who does, I think, very interesting and important research. Social inequalities shape the biologies of racialized groups, and embodied inequalities perpetuate a racialized view of human biology. So it's important, I think, to consider how these categorizations, be they racial or gender or otherwise, rise, fall, or modify. In other words, we have to be skeptical, really, of these ordinary ways in which people are categorized. So my point is that formal definitions enable us to see characteristics differently and to consider the abstract properties of these different phenomena. So we are helped from some of the research in expectation states, which Martha has very much always been a part of. And one of the definitions that has been involved right from the very start of expectation states research was the definition of a diffuse status characteristic. Now, I've modified it somewhat here, but this is taken from early work from Berger, Cohen, and Zeldich in '72, which says a characteristic is called or can be a diffuse status characteristic if there are at least two categorizations, and sometimes there are many more. These categories are differentially evaluated, positive or negatively. There are a distinct category that responds to specific expectations, that is, stereotypes. So women are bad drivers, men are good drivers. Of course, we know those aren't true, but they're still examples of the kind of stereotypes. And for each of these categorizations within the characteristic, one has a higher valuation than the other, or others. So there's differences in evaluation. So early formulations and studies demonstrated that if a characteristic was a diffuse status characteristic, it would organize interaction in a group setting. In the group setting that particularly were investigated were ones that were task-oriented and cooperative kinds of groups. The burden of proof process says that people notice that they're differentiated by these characteristics. It then organizes expectations, not consciously usually, sometimes consciously. And the expectations are for competence of people and success at the tasks in which they are involved. These expectations then drive people's behavior, and then the behavior becomes instantiated in terms of who has most influence, who complies, who's even given the opportunity to act, right, and who takes that opportunity. So the burden of proof process is important for this set of research because it says reproduction of inequality occurs unless something specifically intervenes. So the reproduction is at the center of it, and the question is, what can intervene in the process to stop it? So the contention here is this kind of abstraction creates a way to conceptualize different kinds of groups of phenomenon that appear and are diverse in terms of the history, maybe the countries, maybe the times. So this abstraction, of course, is abstract. It's independent of time and space. So experiments then is the contention that they're particularly good vehicles for the investigation of formal theoretical approaches. Why would that be the case? Well, abstract concepts are not concepts of our ordinary experience. They're artificial. Experiments are artificial, obviously, right? And scope conditions are parameters and can be implemented within a laboratory kind of setting. So we can control on different kinds of things. But I have found over my many years in sociology that the use of experiments often evokes strong reactions within the social sciences. Mad scientist, oh yeah, you're an experimentalist, right? Are you going to torture us? Scientists who are completely divorced from reality. So in this cartoon, there's the person in the ivory tower made out of books saying, no, we just study it. Your job, you people go out and do something. And plain old hubris, the hubris of thinking that experimentalists can somehow isolate effects of the real world phenomenon like race, ethnicity. So even people who don't like experiments and who say we should never use them, like many of the people who write introductory research methods books, always have like a section on experiments where they say, okay, people do experiments and they are powerful. And how are they powerful? They're powerful in establishing causal relations. This is the usual way in which experiments are introduced. And they allow us to control on variables that we know to be theoretically relevant and then randomly assign for factors that we may not know about. But can experiments tell us anything about the real world, because they're artificial? And I have up here, they don't use random sampling, but there are some experiments that do use random sampling. They're rarer, but there are some. Okay, but what I'm arguing is, because experiments are artificial, they're particularly appropriate for formal theoretical studies, and not generally very good for descriptive theoretical studies. So isolating context can enable theorizing about how different social structures might change the operation, for example, of diffuse status characteristics. In other words, and this is the really exciting part, in other words, we might be able to develop processes that are rare or that don't even exist. Maybe we can't find some of these processes anywhere, but we could create them. We can change the structure. But if we don't like the structure, maybe we can change it. And it allows us to ask questions like, well, what if? What if we didn't structure classrooms the way they're ordinarily structured? What if we change the way in which learning occurs? So because experiments are artificial, they provide important vehicles for these tests. Exact class terms, as I've been arguing, are not the terms that we ordinarily use in our everyday interactions. And in this sense, they're artificial. Experiments are artificial. And experiments enable control and randomization, which are important for eliminating alternative interpretations of the data. Okay, but so you have this nice experiment that tests something in an artificial setting. So what? What do we do with it then? Well, the idea is that you're not trying to generalize in the first step. You're not just generalizing to actual settings right away, but that you're testing a theory, and then after the theory is tested, that it can be applied to circumstances. Okay, so I'd like to talk about some of the studies in race ethnicity. And there have been studies, as Martha actually pointed out, on different kinds of social categorizations as well, for example, on gender. In fact, most of the research in the area about interventions has been done on gender. And we can come back to that maybe a little later. But for this particular talk, I want to concentrate on issues on race ethnicity. And it's interesting to me that there are fewer of these studies than in any other kinds of categorizations. And we can also talk about that in a minute. Okay, so some very early experiments, which had some problems in interpretation and also implementation, but I want to talk about this because it's important historically. And also this group, the CATS group, I think doesn't get talked about enough. This was a group of researchers who were very interested and wanted to develop different kinds of ways to intervene in discrimination. So in these early studies, CATS and the researchers brought together Black men and white men who were all college students with high grades, and they worked together in a whole series of cooperative CATS. What happened? Well, even though the men were all in college and they all had almost equivalent GPAs, white men were more influential, they talked more, they talked less to Black men than white men, and Black men deferred to white men. And what do these results mean? Well, even though the men were equated in terms of prior performance, that is, they all had high GPAs, Black men still had less observable power and prestige than white men. That is, they had less influence, they had lower action rates and opportunities. And why was that the case? Well, remember earlier I talked about the burden of proof process that says that if characteristics are brought into a structure, where they're evaluated in certain ways, that reproduction occurs unless something intervenes. Well, in this case, the burden of proof process was not intervened in. That is, the racial categorization was so strong that even the cooperative environments could not intervene. So, what kinds of interventions could change the power of diffuse status characteristics? What could weaken racial ethnicity inequality in groups? So among the very first researchers and in the expectation states tradition was Elizabeth Cohen and her colleagues who worked on interventions in burden of proof processes in junior highs. Now, I thought, when I first learned about Elizabeth Cohen's research, I thought how brave she must have been. And then I met her and realized she's really brave. And one of the reasons she's really brave is, first of all, she's teaching in junior high. And I don't know if you all have had that experience. I have. You have to be brave to teach in junior high where kids are 12, 13, 15. But she also decided to take, well, I think I'll take black boys and white boys who are 12 and 13, and I'll work on trying to intervene in the process there. Okay, and that's like an extra step in terms of bravery from here. And by the way, Elizabeth Cohen was asked to do this research by the state of California right when they were doing busing. And here's kind of the reason. They said, well, busing is a good thing, right? We'll bus so that we'll have less segregation in our schools, which of course was an important goal. But it was as if, well, we'll just put people together and, you know, everything will be fine. Well, no, everything was not fine. So Elizabeth Cohen brought together black and white boys, and she controlled in this very first study, later on this has dropped, but in the very first study, she brought together kids who had about the same grades and who are also about the same size. And again, if you've taught junior high, or you live with a junior high person, you know that for boys, height was an important status characteristic, size was an important status characteristic. And then she created a way to measure inequality or discrimination. And to do that, she created a separate game that she would use. The idea was, I'm going to do these interventions, and then I'm going to see whether they work in a separate kind of structure, in a different kind. And she created this game, which it had to involve people making choices, and then they voted on the choices, so she could measure influence, action opportunities, and action rates, influence and compliance. Okay, so the first thing she did was an idea that used to be very popular in the late 60s and 70s. It used to be called compensatory education. And the idea was, well, let's have the people who are usually marginalized, let's give them a real successful experience. And then this will somehow halo over into other experiences. People still talk about this, by the way. So the first thing that they tried was to teach the black boys to put together a valued object, and then in the late 60s and early 70s, this was a 2-transistor radio. That doesn't sound so cool now, but it was cool. And so the black kids were trained how to do this, and then they got together with the white kids, and then they played the game. It had no effect. That is, the black kids had lower influence, action rates, action opportunities, just like before. It didn't work. Why? Well, one of the ways in which discrimination and inequality, probably the prominent way, is through interaction. It's not that, right? It's not a process by which somebody, because of their characteristic, carries it. It's through the interaction itself. So the next thing they tried was creating more interaction. So they taught the black kids how to put together the 2-transistor radio. And then they had the black kids teach the white kids how to do it. This worked. This did decrease subsequent inequality. And this process, which I think is a very strong process, but which is not usually talked about quite in the same way, involves the idea of teaching someone. So not only do you possess the status of knowing how to do something, but you teach it. And I know that we're all teachers here, and sometimes we forget that, but that's very powerful. That's a very powerful kind of process, and it involves interaction. So this did decrease inequality. So it's an indication that superiority, and it has to be superiority, on the part of those deemed to have lower diffuse status characteristic has an effect. It involved the idea of interaction, which is also really important. Later on, Webster and Driscoll further demonstrated this, sort of reproduced it in another kind of setting, where a person who had initially low diffuse status, a Black woman, was revealed to be very high in terms of their knowledge and performance, and that decreases inequality on the basis of race. Another kind of intervention which my colleagues and I have kind of worked on to take as a base was Elizabeth Cohen's multi-ability intervention. And within the context of the school, Elizabeth Cohen created, and a group, created tasks that were unusual and required lots of different kinds of things. She called them multibility. And then when the kids were interacting on these tasks, the teachers would also say, oh, look, Billy did X. In other words, reinforcing the performance of certain kids, right? And such an example is, we took the kids and said, how do you measure a dinosaur? Well, when you think about it, that's a really complicated kind of thing, right? You have to take into account that some of them have spines, and then how do you figure out the space in between them? You know, it's complicated. So this multi-ability intervention seemed to have an effect and decrease inequality. So one of my graduate students, Carla Gore, and I worked on this idea of multi-ability. And we added a few things and worked a way to test it in a slightly different way. So we used Elizabeth Cohen's insight along with physics formal work to develop a definition of a group task that would change the way in which groups interact. So all we did is change the way we introduced the task. We did not change the task. So this is the idea of how it is that people conceive of different kinds of tasks. We call this the inconsistent complexity. I mean, I say this now, but actually in the first paper, we actually called it something else. We called it incompatible complexity, which confused everyone, especially us, by the way. So now we call it inconsistent complexity, where we say, hey, you know, as a group, you're going to work on these kinds of issues, and they're really complex, and they involve a lot of different kinds of abilities. And why would this work? As I'll show you, it does work, but it seems like it shouldn't work when I just tell you about it. But what it intervenes in is the use of unitary labels like smart and dumb. And when I teach actually every course that I teach, I'll often ask students to tell me about the labels that they use. And everyone uses the label smart and dumb still. And you hear it all the time. Young kids have different names for smart and dumb, but they still mean smart and dumb, right? So there's still this idea somehow that smart and dumb are unitary concepts and it applies to everything. And so this intervention actually just stops that kind of process. We also added a component regarding task efficiency. So our point here was, suppose that we can decrease inequality. Will people really use this later on if it doesn't also not decrease how well the group does? I mean, you can hear the arguments right now, right? So we wanted to say, would it have an impact on how well the group did? So we use tasks that have objectively correct responses. And actually in the Gore and Sell piece, we used questions from SATs, and we used, a mix of different kinds of questions. So this enabled an assessment of how interventions affect performance of groups. We randomly assigned groups composed of 2 white women and 1 black woman to either a baseline condition, which was no intervention. And I want to say here that this is extremely important in experiments, especially on social characteristics. Sometimes people will not use a baseline condition and just assume that they know a level of inequality, and that's not justified. It's frankly not justified. So we used a baseline versus the inconsistent complexity condition. Okay, and what happens is when we define the groups, define the task as being very complicated and having lots of different abilities, that condition had less inequality between black women and white women than the baseline condition. So in the baseline conditions, white women were more influential, had higher action rates, all of that, than black women. And in the inconsistent complexity, it's almost completely equal in terms of action rates and what we call procedural operations. And the group success of the solutions was not different. It's not statistically different, but lots of the reviewers wanted to say that it was statistically different because actually the inconsistent complexity people did better, but not statistically better. But the important point is they didn't do worse. The definition of the task, but not the task itself, led to less inequality in experimental groups, the inconsistent complexity groups, and the baseline. And it did not lead to lower performance. And I want to mention the idea about performance here because in the organizational literature, there's a lot of literature about performance and diversity, and some of it had suggested that diverse groups just would not be as productive because people would be kind of fighting among themselves more. And I think that the issue there has to do with how we define the scope conditions under certain contexts. We then looked at inconsistent complexity over time. So one question that gets asked a lot in experiments, which should get asked, is, okay, yeah, you guys can do something for 2 minutes and then test it, 10 minutes later. How about later on? And so in this particular study, we looked at 3 time periods over about a little over 3 weeks. We used another ethnic group. This was done in Texas. We used Mexican American women and white women in groups. It was the same intervention. That is, we defined the task as either we didn't define the task or we defined it as one involving inconsistent complexity. And then the difference here is we actually had individuals work on a problem alone and then in the group, so we had an exact measure of how their opinions were changed by the group context. We measured this at 3 different times. The manipulation, which is relatively short, like about 5 to 10 minutes, occurs at time 1 and then doesn't occur at time 2 or time 3. This particular study also considered a concept in industrial organizations that's used called synergy. Synergy is a measure of whether the group decisions are actually better than any individual within the group. That is, does the group do better than separate individuals? And there's something called strong and weak synergy that we investigated. Okay, so we find less inequality in the inconsistent complexity condition. Okay, so we're revisiting the Gore and Sell. And even though the manipulation occurred at only time 1, its effect lasted the whole time. And there was greater synergy in the incompatible complexity condition than the baseline. So the groups were doing better than the individuals alone in the inconsistent complexity condition. And when you look at within the data, you can see why that's the case, because they actually listen to each other more than they do in the baseline conditions. And I forgot to say that in all of these cases, we videotape these, and then we can code the components and what people are saying afterwards. Okay, another of my wonderful graduate students, CJ Murphy, in 2017, asked kind of an unusual question, I think. She asked whether competition with another group heightens inequality within the groups who are competing. And her idea was that when you're competing with another group, it creates sort of another thing that people are considering. Like, you might be a great, let's say, you might be a great footballer, but how are you when you have to compete, when you're in the height of competition? Does that change the way you interact? And so she had predicted that groups' inequality would heighten when competition was stressed. And then does it lead to changes in effectiveness? She used Black and white women in the United States and Texas. And competition did increase within group inequality relative to the baseline. The intervention of competition did not affect performance, but it did affect inequality. So when you're in a group and you're told either you're going to get the reward or the other person's going to get the reward, or other groups are, either your group will get the reward or the other group will get the reward. When you think that you're in competition for that, in your group, there's a greater inequality, not less. So zero-sum competition with another group increases inequality within the competing groups, at least under the specified scope conditions. We can talk about this later on if you want. And the scope conditions involve, remember, no authority present and no feedback during interaction. Participation opportunities. Walker, Dewar, and Webster, colleagues of Martha and I, in 2014, thought, well, suppose we control who it is that's acting. Theoretically, that should mean that in subsequent decisions, that should halo over and give them more power in groups. So they controlled participation rates by setting the computer assignments. A computer would assign who talked next, and they rigged the computer so that in these groups of Black and white women, Black women were given more opportunity to talk. It wasn't regulated by the group, it was regulated by an outside force, the computer. Participation rates for Black women were compared to baseline and the no control participation. And Black women's influence was higher when they had been given greater chances to participate at one point in time. Then that haloed over and they participated more in subsequent points in time. So enabling higher action rates for a person who was labeled as a low and diffuse status, in this case Black women, decreased inequality in subsequent decisions. So I come to the use of double standards research, for which Martha Foschi is well known. The idea is that different standards apply to different people, specifically that those lower in diffuse status must demonstrate that they're more worthy than someone who's high in status. And led to this experiment on what we can term accountability by Dewar, Webster, and Walker in 2017. They used Martha's design for a resume study, and it involved a group of people who were actually randomly sampled to assess a Black candidate and a white candidate in their suitability for an engineering position, competence and suitability. And so there was a comparison between conditions in which you were told, turn in your decisions, we'll use them, don't write your name, versus write your name, you may have to explain your decisions. And Martha's worked on this concept as well. And the accountability manipulation decreased discrimination based on race. Okay, so let me just summarize the intervention. Experiments, my argument goes, enable us to determine how principles operate in simple or artificial environments. And this way they test the principles. They're not meant to recreate real situations necessarily, but they do inform us about settings that might not even exist or are rare in the ordinary world. So, what's a summary? To decrease racial ethnic inequality within groups, notice this is within groups, you can change who interacts. Expose all group members to those with initially low diffuse status but who have superior talent. Change people's participation in group interactions, provide more action opportunities for those who are traditionally less powerful. So one thing I've done in my gender classes is that for the first, usually 3 weeks, I clandestinely keep track of who talks in class. And even though the class is often predominantly women, men always seem to talk more than women. But I don't reveal that until we get to a section, and then I ask the class to tell me what they think before I show them the data. And they never, almost never, sometimes some of the women do pick up on that, but almost, and very rarely the men, right? But almost never do they pick up on that. And so then I show them the data. So yes, if you can change a way in which people participate, that can decrease inequality. You can change how tasks are represented. Clearly define how tasks are complex and not unidimensional. And I think this just shows us the strength of the idea that smart and dumb, or competent, non-competent, however we think of these binaries, are really powerful. So emphasize that that's not the case. Do not emphasize direct competition with another group in terms of zero sum. Again, you can think of many applications, I think, in the classroom. Make individual decision makers publicly accountable for their decisions about candidates, and I mean candidates for anything. But notice that this assumes that they know the norms and policies, so the norms and policies have to be there as well. And there's a lot of important work in psychology on the importance of, for example, descriptiveness. Oh, most people do this versus you should do this. I think that this is important too, because sometimes people think of this as only an individual case, but you notice that it involves the interaction between a person and a referent group or policies. Some notes about these interventions. My favorite is it doesn't involve changing people. It doesn't say you're a bad person. It doesn't say you're a good person. It just says, here are differences in the structure. It involves really very little time and money to implement. It can be used in lots of different settings. I know I gave lots of examples about school, but it can be used in organizations. It can be used in nonprofits. It could be used in medical teams. And I'm working with another former student of mine who is working on medical teams and developing interventions in medical teams. Okay, mysteries, lots of mysteries. Here's a big mystery. It's an old mystery, I think. There's differences between attitudes and behavior. Okay, so we all know that there's a lot of research on problems in trying to match up attitudes with behavior, right? But sometimes the answers seem wildly different. We just finished a series of studies that indicates that attitudes and behavior don't necessarily match, and we find this in terms of contact theory, which is a powerful theory in this realm about how more contact you have with different kinds of people, the less prejudiced you are. And we find that doesn't necessarily predict how you act in groups at all. So that kind of discrepancy has also been noted in recent field studies. Oh, and I wanted to point out that one of your colleagues in the economics department, Dr. Lowe, has just recently published a very interesting study on cricket teams on cricket teams in India. And he also what he finds is differences in behavior but not necessarily attitudes, which is interesting. You almost think it would be the other way around, right? But in our studies, we seem to find that people will change their behavior, but not necessarily their attitudes. And there are a lot of different ideas about why that might be the case. It's a very complicated issue, I think. Okay, so I'm not saying that experiments are the only way to develop and test formal theoretical formulations. I don't believe that at all. Lots of different methodologies can be used. But I am arguing, since I'm an experimentalist, right? I am arguing that the artificialities of experiments is an important advantage, especially to say, what if we change the entire structure? Pretty hard to convince a school to change their entire structure, but you could change initially a lab entire structure, right? What if? Special thanks to Dr. Foschi for her steadfast adherence to careful research. Martha is known throughout our discipline as someone who really cares about precision and carefulness. And to my past and present students, always. Thank you. Question? Anyone want to argue? No, thank you for turning that on. Martha.
I would like to say something about Elizabeth Cohen, which is generally not known. I think you know this. She was a very brave and committed person, but she also endured discrimination. In this case, it was directly from the sociology department at Stanford. I think the department was instructed to do things like that, but she couldn't get a job in sociology because she was married to a member of the department. Nothing that I know would stop her. She then went to the Department of the School of Education, where they welcomed her and she could develop all of her experience.
Yes.
Thanks. So thank you so much for the talk. I love a good experiment, so this is very fun. I also really like the inconsistent complexity idea, which I hadn't heard before, so that was really interesting. I had two questions. The first was, you found that the type of task didn't matter when they were doing the experiments with inconsistent complexity. And I was wondering if it, so earlier, sort of really early psychological research, it talks about the importance of superordinate goals, right? So I was wondering, like the radio, that was something everyone wanted, like it was a fun thing, but it wasn't something that you really needed to do together. Did it matter if it was something that you needed all people to engage in together? And you talk a little bit about that later when you talked about the idea that decisions that were made better together, but in some of the earlier research, it was like pushing a truck up, at the camps or the boys' camps where you push the truck up and you needed all the boys to help that or whatever. I was wondering if the task would matter if it was something you had to cooperate to do. And my second question was, the hypothesis that competition with another group should increase inequality within the group, that's like 100% the opposite of what I would expect.
Yeah.
And I'm so surprised that that actually turned out to be true, because I assumed that there would be sort of a rally around the flag condition, right? So as soon as you have competition with another group, that you should feel really, the in-group cooperation should go up and the feeling of solidarity should go up, because now it's like we're all together against this side of the room, right? But it didn't work that way. And why is that? That seems very different than other research.
Okay, so thank you for the question. So the first one, the task, is exactly what we're actually looking at now, because even though we got similar results with all the tasks we used, some of the tasks had greater results than others, and it wasn't the timing or anything. Some tasks seemed to be different. And so one of the things we're exploring right now is the ambiguity of the task. We've completed the experiment, but I haven't analyzed the data yet. But I expect that I think that when tasks are more ambiguous, they actually enable maybe more inequality. rather than less. I think there was another part to that question, but I can go to the
And
second.
inequality within the group, the competition with the outsiders, that
yeah.
makes that.
Yeah, yes, the second question. Okay, so we, in her study, she compares the group in which they say, if you do really well, you'll earn a reward, and the reward is the same for the conditions. And the other one, only one of you will get the reward. And she predicted, because of the idea of competition driving the interaction, that what it does is it actually takes less attention to the group and more to the idea of competition. And what happens in these groups is that the white women just take over. So, yeah, now, why it's, I agree, it doesn't seem like any of you have been on sports teams or any kind of teams, right? We all know that the cooperative structure tends to bring the group together. But I think part of this question is, how does it bring the group together? And one of the things that she looked at, and I kind of get chills just from thinking, because it's not a comfortable idea at all, is that we had actually thought that the competition would make people like the group more, right? And it makes the white women like the group more. But the black women are like, no, I don't like this group. And why? Because they're being ignored, right? Yeah. Yeah, I have yet to, I think there's a lot more to this. There's a lot more theoretical issues that we have to look at. So, and in thinking about some of the research in the sports teams and so forth, which does seem to lessen inequality. You have, in a sports team, you have a lot more going on, and there's, I'm sure lots of you have played sports or looked at it, where it's not just the game, it's the idea of doing a good, having a really nice move or helping someone out, or, you know, doing things in a lot of different kinds of sequences. So that may be part of the difference as well. Yeah, really good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the back.
So I just have two questions. One, the first part of your talk, you started to talk about how language is reflective of a particular space and time. So I was wondering how that, I was wondering how that shows up in your actual research. And then the other question is just more technical. When you're doing these experiments, how often are you doing them? And how generalizable do you think the results? Like, Texas has a particular understanding of race. Does it translate to other contexts?
Okay, so let me take the second question first, and then I'll probably forget your first question, but let me take the second one first. That's, yes, and so the contexts do vary, right? And so that's why the baselines are so important, for you to know what the starting point is in terms of whatever kind of process that you're looking at. Without a baseline, you can't assess it. And some of the very early studies didn't have it, you know, in the 50s and 40s, they didn't have any baseline. So it was hard to assess really what kind of change might occur. And yes, we have found, we've done research in different parts of the country, and in some of my other research in other countries, and of course, it makes a huge difference, right? And it comes back to make a big difference when you start applying the principles. You have to know a lot about the culture to understand what is a value, for example, what is a valued task? What is a value, you know, what is it that people start, where's the starting point, where are you starting? Okay, and then your other question was about.
Oh, it was two.
See, I told you.
How big are these experiments? So like, and they're all taken from a population of university students.
Yeah, so so how big are the experiments? So the experiments vary a lot in size, and we've done some, I guess so the biggest experiments I've done have been like 200 and some. So
200 groups?
150 groups. Maybe 200. So a lot more people. And the idea about the populations involved. Okay, so there's one criticism that all experimentalists hate, and then there's another criticism that even though they hate it, they better consider it. Okay, so the first one that they hate is that where you get your participants really makes a difference. And it can, and that again, that is why you have to have a baseline to tell what the starting point is. But if you're using random assignment, all of these other issues, they should be distributed equally in the different conditions. The other criticism, though, has to do with replication, I think. And that is, too often, I believe, experimentalists say, well, we don't have to go other places because here we are in our nice lab, and I have to admit it's much safer in our lab sometimes. But we really do need to replicate using different groups, always with the idea of the baseline. So the second idea, I think, is one that we haven't really discussed seriously enough, and I agree with you. I've done a little bit of different work. It's very hard sometimes to get in different situations where you can do this, but hard work is part of what we do.
It wasn't a critique. It's just more the idea that using a characteristic like race, we haven't eliminated the other explanatory factors, perhaps.
Right. So yeah, and that's the idea of the cultural.
People down and deny that variability.
Yeah, we can talk more about that. I see. Of course, I understand. Yes, you have a question.
Yeah, it was more of this line of questioning, but I'm really interested in how the internet has changed experience. So these large experiments for people who don't have observed or from color as a way to address this kind of weird phenomenon where all these experiments are done on highly educated people in certain countries. But there's problems with that for sure, I would understand, but doesn't it seem like there's a huge opportunity to expand who is taking these? You could replicate it across many different countries, studies by reaching many different countries, and just the kind of exciting potential and opportunities that we have now to move beyond labs in universities.
Okay, so I'm involved in a couple internet experiments now, and I agree with you that they have all these opportunities, but also as a control freak, which is probably why I'm an experimentalist. Crazy sometimes. So you have to be really careful. So you don't want people driving in their cars, taking your study, for example, which we've had. You want to be really careful. But it does offer an opportunity sometimes for different cultures. So in some of African countries, for example, where cell phones are used all the time, that could be an important opportunity for sure. And that's something that we're actually checking into now. So yeah, it's problematic, but I think if you're in tune enough with the culture and with what's going on, it's possible. It's just you have to be really careful. Some of the internet experiments seem problematic in terms of incentives. So if you know much about amateur, you know that there are a lot of people who just about do it professionally, right? And I always envision these people late at night, because that's when it's I get all this data, working, and that's sometimes problematic. So, and actually that goes back to maybe your question too. The incentives are always, you want to be careful about what the incentives are for the particular situation. You don't want to be exploitive, because that's all of its own problems, right? And at the same time, you want to try as much as possible to equalize it. And what little work I've done cross-culturally, that has been a real issue about the incentive structure that we want to be really careful about that.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting, and I find your point about the what if really compelling. I think it's a great way to think about interventions and how they translate into other non-experimental contexts. I have a couple questions. One is like a really basic question, which is, the images that you were using as part of your talk, I was struck by how racially ambiguous some of the people were. At least I was like, I don't know how I would characterize that person. And so and I was struck by your point early in your talk about how we should be thinking about race in terms of interaction, which I think is really important and insightful, but at the same time, people get assigned these categories at the beginning. And so I'm just curious about whether, or how you think that through, right? Of like, that participants in these experiments know how they're categorized at the beginning, or maybe that's just not even an issue, but as I was looking at the images, I was like, oh, I don't know if I was interacting with these people, if I would actually have a clear sense of what racial status they had, which maybe raises issues about just skin color.
So one of the things that we do at the beginning of the study is, depending on where we are, we ask people for their own identities, and then everyone in the group knows how people identify,
So
which is a very important.
It's formalized.
Yes, it's formalized, and also it's different in different areas. So in Texas, it's quite different than it is, for example, in Ohio, even within the states. And in places like South Sudan, it's quite different. It's a tribal membership. Right?
So I have another question, which is to some degree about translating these findings into other settings. And you made a really interesting point about how this is not about changing people, it's about changing situations. And it struck me that, in a way, there's a distinction between expressed bias and latent bias, I guess, or that the bias is there, it can be activated or it can be deactivated. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but it made me think about recent research on kind of equity and diversity training that suggests that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that it actually makes people defensive and may actually exacerbate these problems. And so I felt like that seems like exactly the kind of area where we could do these kind of what ifs. And anyway, I'm really curious about your thoughts about that.
Well, I agree with you a lot about this. I've been working on some papers about DEI training and what it has involved, and I don't think we can paint use just one way to look at it. I don't mean to disparage about it, but yes, there's been instances where they seem to find backlash. And I've worked on some papers trying actually to replicate some of that. But so the famous example is, relatively famous. Probably all have had bias training. Well, one of the first things they do is they say, look, don't feel bad. Everyone has biases, right? And so when they say everyone has biases, it's been almost like giving permission to people to, okay, I'm biased, so what? And so then they often talk about then how you as an individual can change that. But I just think it's problematic, and I know it's my bias, right, as a person who studies interaction, but I think it's interaction and how this inequality is reproduced. It's reproduced through interaction. Sometimes it's big interaction up here, but lots of times it's just group, it's group interaction, and they feed into each other, right? So I would say, because this is the work I do, I would say we need to think about interaction much more than how to change maybe people. And this is also my discomfort with this attitude, the attitude problem about what does it mean when you change someone's attitude. So you probably know there's just so much literature out there that shows that contact decreases people's prejudice. But then how does that get translated? Yeah, it decreases their prejudice, their attitudes. And what happens when they're actually interacting? I mean, that's I don't know, it's a real, It's very problematic and it's very uncomfortable, right? Because we would like to think and it's built on kind of this rational model. Well, if people think a certain way, then they act in a certain way. But we all know, I mean, we can't even predict our own behavior, right? Yeah, so we all have instances of that, I'm sure. I remember something I'm so ashamed of all these years. I remember that one of my department head at the time used to pat me on the head, literally. And I thought, why did I not just scream out, don't do that to me? I didn't. I mean, just drives me crazy. But the attitude behavior issue is, it's been problematic for a long time. I just don't think we have a good grasp on it. So if we don't have a good grasp, I think we should concentrate on behavior, right? Behavior and policy that changes that behavior.
I think we have time for one more question.
Probably a horrible last question. Because I feel like, at least in my understanding, it opens up quite a can of worms. But the question that I have is around the repeated characterization of experiments as artificial. And what it is to have something be artifice, what the criteria for artifice are. I'm also an experimentalist, but a very different kind of experimentalist. I feel like that's like a confession that we have to do. Hello, my name is Lindsay, and I'm a sociologist that does, experiments. And part of the reason why I ask that is because across the range of types of experiments, you end up with labs that are, creating particular interactions or particular kinds of characteristics. Then there's like field experimental work, and I think about also the work of outside of academia, like behavioral insights teams around the world that started in Britain, but really have proliferated widely, where they're basically saying, we're going to kind of ask what if, but then we're just going to go ahead and say, this is, right? That's maybe not the right the right two words to characterize that, but they're no longer saying what if. They're like, we're just going to change things and see how people operate under different conditions at scale in these very interesting ways. And so, in some ways I agree with the idea of a characterization of experiments as artifice, because you're creating conditions that wouldn't necessarily exist otherwise. But then there's also just a broader application of experimental work that involves like randomization at scale in ways that allow us to think not necessarily about experiments as artifice, but as experiments as like ways of as actually creative process. And there's not really a question in there, but I was just wondering about your thoughts about that, because the idea of experiments as artificial really predominates your setup. And I don't think that the work that you've done and that other experimentalists have done is necessarily, I think there's a very specific definition of artificial that doesn't do a service to the methodological approach.
Well, that's a lovely comment, really. I think I took the artificial, because that's the criticism that's given us, the old and new criticism there. But you're right, I shouldn't take the language of the oppressor, should I? No, yours is much more wonderful.
I was given a note saying that we can get another question, so.
Oh, yes, hi.
Hi, I have a question, I think relating more to Amy's question on DEI. From a life course perspective, the history of the studies we're talking about, right, some of them were young boys, and then some of them were at school age, and then I almost wonder if like the workplace training is too late, because we've been growing up in segregated neighborhoods, going to segregated schools, and de facto, even though it's, again, the law is wage, but I just wonder if at that point, if it matters at what point you do these interventions, if someone's brain has like developed, like if these prejudices get ingrained, it matters that you do.
Well, see, that's another lovely question, because that's an issue that, again, experimentalists I don't think have addressed in a truly meaningful way, which is to look over the life course of those. So there are a few studies on kids, and I mentioned Elizabeth Cohen's where I thought she was so brave because but at the same time, it's early enough, you know, in intervention. So we know that, yes, it makes a difference. We know that because, you know, the developmental literature. But, and as I said, there have been a few, but part of it has to do with, I'm sure, restrictions on children and how it is that studies can be done with children. But that is a wonderful point. There have been a few studies in the contact theory literature, and those studies find that, you know, pretty big effects early on if you can kind of arrange contact. Okay, that was part of the idea, but that there's a lot of variance. And that always leads to the question about what is it about the contact and how can you control that more? And I think that would probably be the issue that would arise. That literature, I wish I could conjure up, I think it was Bielman, maybe. I can give you the site later on, but finds big effects in children. And now there have been, and again on contact theory, there have been some interesting studies on stigma and contact, and that stigmatized individuals with disabilities, that has been the most successful of the contact theory interventions that they've done. So kind of like, it used to be called mainstreaming, you know, ideas like that. Those have, I think, been incorporated in classroom kinds of settings. I like your question. I think it's a great question. Yeah.
Just a couple comments to reflections, if I may. So firstly, Martha, it's so wonderful to see you here again at this special event. It's great to celebrate melding research and teaching together, and Tom Campbell is an exemplar in this regard. So congratulations. Dr. Sell, thank you so much for coming all the way to Vancouver. This has been really a lovely and enjoyable occasion and a great thought-provoking talk. And we're all very much appreciative. A former grad student in our department, Adam Benzelli-Yang, did this kind of ethnographic study of co-ed futsal soccer here at UBC, and these are competitive games, of course, we want to win, and you know, the men scored most of the goals and made most of the passes. These kind of qualities manifested themselves quite profoundly in this competitive environment. And I wonder if, because it's competitive, this is a time to dial down on our expectations. This is not a time to reinvent the wheel, you know, and to try to celebrate new ways of thinking. We have to work with what we've got, and we've got to win this environment. So perhaps the idea that inequalities manifest themselves more strongly in these kinds of environments kind of does make sense to me. And then finally, my reflection is that, so along the line of thinking about the artificiality of experiments, my classroom is also artificial in this way, and you've really made me reflect about the way I set it up and how I assign students to groups and what's occurring in the room. The processes you've spoken to are revealing themselves in my classroom. I think I have to be more thoughtful about intervening in the sorts of ways that you suggested.
Thank you.
I think maybe on that note, we could thank you so much.